Buenas tardes. Thank you very much. First, I would like to acknowledge, as activists try to do in the US and elsewhere, and as the very moving opening ceremony urged us to do, that we are convening on colonized land. And so I would like to pay tribute to the Mapuche, the original inhabitants of the land on which we meet. It is not only important to encourage historical memory, but also to recognize that the consequences of colonization continue to oppress indigenous peoples today. If we believe in justice, equality, and freedom, it is our responsibility to engage in material practices of solidarity with indigenous peoples today. It is a great honor to be able to participate in the 10th Encuentro of the Hemispheric Institute. And I'd like to express my deepest gratitude to Deanna Taylor for having invited me. It has been enlightening and inspiring to attend performances and presentations, and I can say that I was especially moved by Alfredo Jar's presentation last night and the way he helped us to discover hope in the most unmitigable and disheartening circumstances. He certainly demonstrated why we need artists to point the way to the future. I appreciate the invitation to participate in the Encuentro. And I'm especially happy to be able to visit Chile. Chile, 44 years after I first came here to thank the people of Chile for their inestimable contributions to the struggle for my freedom. Had the opportunity to visit Recoleta and the Población Angela Davis. I cannot tell you how inspiring it was to witness the art, the collective enthusiasm, and the overall determination to fight for a better life. I had not really expected to feel so moved. I was also very moved by my meeting with the Federation of Students of the University of Chile. And of course you saw the 1972 meeting at the Technical University of Chile. This time, I had the occasion to meet with the students and a number of student feminist groups. And was happy to add my voice to the struggle for free abortion. Aborto libre. First visited Chile, as you heard, in October of 1972. I had been acquitted and released a few months earlier, As a matter of fact, I was acquitted on June 4th, 1972. It was a time full of hope. The Cuban Revolution, the African Liberation Movement, the Vietnamese were resisting US militarism. The victory we experienced in my case was cause for celebration. Today, people often ask me how I would like to be remembered. I suppose you reach a certain age, and that is the question that is posed to you. And my answer is always that I'm not really that concerned about how I'm remembered as an individual. I'll be gone. But I would like people to remember the movement that made it possible for me to walk free. And let me talk for a moment about that era. With respect to what one might call global revolutionary temporalities, it was a very hopeful time. But in the United States, it was a time of conservatism and anti-communism and repression. We interpreted that repression as an attempt on the part of capitalism by its political figures to prevent the inevitable, to prevent the advent of global liberation. Despite the fact that this may not have been was not an accurate reading of the times, we did experience important political victories during that era, including the forced resignation of Richard Nixon. But let me recapitulate for a moment the circumstances of my case. As I said, Richard Nixon was president. I was in jail in California where Ronald Reagan was governor. Certainly looking forward to a trajectory that would lead him to the White House. And J. Edgar Hoover was director of the FBI. Some would have described this triumvirate as the most powerful political force in the world. And of course, with that combined force, they were pursuing me. I was charged, as you heard, with 3 capital offenses. I stood to be sentenced to death 3 times. Many people who were convinced of my innocence at that time believed, nevertheless, that it was impossible to score a victory against this triumvirate. However, and this is what I hope people will remember, with the aid of a global movement, an international movement, we were victorious. Remember, this was a time of communist internationalism. And as critical as we might be of the then socialist community of nations, it is important to recognize how people joined hands around the planet and said no to a capitalist future. In the campaign for my freedom, there were communists, there were socialists, there were trade unionists, there were people of faith from churches and synagogues and mosques and Buddhist temples, there were students, there were athletic clubs, there were sororities and fraternities, virtually every aspect of civil society, including here in Chile, was represented in the campaign for my freedom. And we won. We won. Today, people sometimes refer to me as an icon, which I really don't like. But I've come to recognize that my image circulates as a witness to that collective people's power. It is this movement that I hope people will remember. I hope they will remember that against insurmountable odds, against the most powerful political figures in the world, we won. We won. But we realized that that was also a period of retaliation and revanchism, the most obvious example of which was the CIA-backed coup against Salvador Allende and the Unidad Popular, during which, and as a result of which, kidnapping was normalized and torture. The life of Victor Jara and the lives of so many others were claimed. The image of the detainees inside the stadium will remain forever etched on my memory. And so we would begin a very long campaign of solidarity with the people of Chile. And so we learned how to say, El pueblo unido jamás será vencido. Of global capitalism, unrestrained privatization, neoliberal ideologies, which people here in Chile are very much acquainted with, we need to carry with us the lessons of the possibility of victory. Freedom is a constant struggle. This is the title of my most recent book, and that title is drawn from a freedom song that was repeatedly sung in the southern United States during the mid-20th century freedom movement. Freedom is a constant struggle. They say that freedom is a constant struggle. They say that freedom is a constant struggle. We have struggled so long, we must be free. We must be free. The other verses of the song evoke crying and moaning and sorrow and dying. They say that freedom is a constant dying. We've died so long, we must be free. And I like the irony of the last line of each of the verses. We've struggled so long, we've cried so long, we've sorrowed so long, we've moaned so long, we've died so long, we must be free, we must be free. There is both critique and inspiration. We must be free, we must be free. But are we really free? This song, it seems to me, was designed to forge community. Freedom emerges from the very process of struggling. As we attempt to achieve freedom, we discover other dimensions of freedom. We transform our suffering, our sorrow, our moaning, our dying, our pain into joy. This song reminds us that the activist work of those who continue to campaign for the freedom of political prisoners, against the prison industrial complex, against capitalist and heteropatriarchal institutions and ideologies, can never move forward except in arenas created and recreated by artists. This is why I so appreciate the themes of this encuentro, which emphasize the interconnectedness of art, performance, activism, scholarship. The theme of my talk is prison abolition to Black Lives Matter, social movements and the global struggle for justice. The campaign to abolish imprisonment as we know it has a very long history. It emerged at the intersection of many struggles. The struggle against police violence, which in the US stretches all the way back to the era of slavery and its aftermath. The struggle to free political prisoners in the US and throughout the world. Anti-racist struggles, anti-capitalist movements, environmental movements, LGBTQ movements, feminist movements. Thus, the abolitionist movement is a very capacious movement. It recognizes, for example, that prisons are gendering apparatuses, and that to abolish imprisonment as we know it is also to abolish the policing of gender. Trans prisoners and former prisoners are thus playing an important theoretical and practical role in building the movement against the prison industrial complex. The abolitionist movement is rooted in the struggles of the 1960s and 1970s, the period I evoked in the discussion of my own case, which I used to preface these remarks. But importantly, we are now observing the 50th anniversary of the Black Panther Party, which was founded in 1966. Yes. And remember that the Black Panther Party was founded by young people who were resisting police violence in the community and by people who were opposing the disproportionate incarceration of Black people and people of color. In the aftermath of the death of Trayvon Martin, in 2012, the Black Lives Matter hashtag was created. And it eventually grew into a network, especially in the wake of the killing of Mike Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, 2 years ago. The message of the Black Lives Matter movement is that Black lives are not abstract and fungible lives that can be subject to repression under the sign of the universal equality of human beings. The Black Lives Matter movement challenges the tyranny of the universal. There's something very important and powerful that Black lives offer. Histories and temporalities and languages and aesthetics and possibilities of freedom. And of course, it was in the Caribbean that this tyranny of the universal was first challenged by the Haitian Revolution. If we examine the struggle against slavery in this hemisphere, we know that in every important movement there were resonances with the Haitian Revolution. The insistence by women and men who came to call themselves Haitiens that to be human is to collectively struggle to be free. There is no such thing as the freedom of a single universe, of a single individual. We know that freedom, as it has been conceived under bourgeois democracies, has always been a limited freedom, a freedom accorded to racial, class, and gender elites, a freedom that acquires its value precisely through its practices and powers of exclusion, race, class, gender, sexuality. There are many now in the US who insist and I'm not going to name any names, but I assume you know who I'm speaking about. There are many who now insist that instead of proclaiming that Black lives matter, we should argue that all lives matter. Do they not realize the extent to which such universal proclamations have always boasted racism? More often than not, universal categories have been clandestinely racialized. Any critical engagement with racism requires us to understand the tyranny of the universal. For most of our history, the very category human has not embraced Black people, people of color, indigenous people. Its abstractness, its very abstractness has been colored white, and it has been gendered male. See the 1981 collectively edited anthology from the US that is entitled All the Women Are White. All the Blacks are men, but some of us are brave. If indeed all lives mattered, we would not need to emphatically proclaim that Black lives matter. Or, as we discover on the Black Lives Matter website, Black women matter, Black girls matter, Black gay lives matter, Black bi lives matter, Black boys matter, Black queer lives matter, Black men matter, Black lesbians matter, Black trans lives matter, Black immigrants matter, Black incarcerated lives matter, Black differently abled lives matter. Yes, Black lives matter. This moment, we are experiencing the revenge of history and the strike back of those who call for such achievements as making America great again. So we are rising up again, and we are calling for an end to racism in the institutions of policing and punishment, in the institutions of education. The demands for the abolition of policing as we know it, the abolition of prisons as we know them, no longer seem like the crazy formulations of misguided idealists. Such demands are beginning to make a great deal of sense. And this is within the context of stronger calls to end the Israeli occupation of Palestine. And Black Lives Matter activists and advocates are calling for justice for Palestine. Justice for Palestine, immigrant rights from North America to Southeast Asia to Africa and the Middle East are emerging as pivotal issues. Thus, we're also witnessing the limits of limited citizenship and are compelled to raise the meaning of global citizenship, and thus to challenge the extent to which the nation state always appears to create barriers around our ideas and our struggles. What might it mean to imagine a future in which nationalism and the nation state no longer loom so large. We're called upon to raise the age-old questions of capitalism and slavery, as did Eric Williams. We're called upon to understand the intentional underdevelopment of the third world in accordance with the theories of Walter Rodney. And yes, there is a strike back from the state. A young woman by the name of Jasmine Abdullah, a queer Black Lives Matter activist, was just recently convicted for having attempted to prevent the arrest of one of her comrades. What was the charge? This is in the state of California, and not the California of Ronald Reagan, but this is 40 years later. She was charged with felony lynching. Felony lynching for participating in a demonstration. You know, I said that there were certain figures whose names I didn't necessarily want to evoke, but it seems I may have to. Because I think it is so important to recognize the extent to which Donald Trump and the campaign to move him in the direction of the White House has revealed the depth of racism in our society. How deeply white racism and white rage resides in certain populations in the US. And I think that we are beginning to recognize that we will have to do everything within our power to prevent the election of Donald Trump. It will spell disaster for the world. This is our responsibility to the planet. Because we would like to be able once again to imagine democratic futures. Democratic futures, we are beginning to recognize, will not be based on the assimilation of communities who have been marginalized by existing structures of what we call democracy. And if one thinks about all of the strategies for the last half century or longer, have been strategies of assimilation. Assimilation into existing states of affairs have never fully brought us progress. Progress with respect to democracy and freedom have only ever occurred with the challenging and reimagining and restructuring of institutions and discourses and knowledges. Revolutions, whether they be political or scientific or discursive, are always dependent upon a willingness to let go of what seems most natural, of what seems most normal, of what seems most comfortable. And we have learned major lessons from indigenous peoples throughout the world who have never called for assimilation, but have rather called for justice and sovereignty. I think that as we develop our strategies for struggle during this period, we have a great deal to learn from the struggles of indigenous people. Speaking of assimilation, I want to conclude my remarks with a simple example from the United States. I don't know whether you are aware, but we are involved in a discussion about placing a woman's image on our paper money. No woman's image has ever appeared on the bills of various denominations. So it's argued that this is the time to make the shift. And so I was recently asked whether I was happy to learn that Harriet Tubman's image may very well displace Andrew Jackson's image on the $20 bill. And of course, I rush to support any attempt to address U.S. historical amnesia, historical absent-mindedness by asking us to think seriously about the role of slaveholder Andrew Jackson, who orchestrated many Indian removal campaigns. But to simply replace him with abolitionist Harriet Tubman, who is one of my heroes, to simply replace him with her image is to ignore the role that capitalism plays and played in sustaining slavery and settler colonialism and racism more broadly. This assimilationalist stance does not permit us to consider other possibilities. Instead of further legitimating the role of money by affixing Harriet Tubman's image to the $20 bill, imagine the possibility of abolishing the centrality of money altogether. In other words, by imagining a world in which what is most needed by living beings could not be so easily transformed into commodities. And this is indeed the meaning of the prison abolitionist movement. We call not simply for the abolition of the institutions of punishment per se. We are demanding the creation of a society which no longer relies on institutions such as prisons for security. And therefore, the call for the abolition of prisons is a call for free housing, free health care. It is a call for free education. And of course, if what is most needed by human beings could not be so easily transformed in a commodity, this might very well mean that education would no longer be commodified. And so therefore we would have tuition-free education. And free health care. Free mental health care. An end to homelessness and affordable housing for everyone. And this would be the beginning of the democratic and hopefully socialist futures we all deserve. Muchas gracias.